So I'd like to welcome in my first guest. This is Justine Wills. She's a member of the Lakota people. So Justine, I will unmute you, I believe. And if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Justine Wills, Lakota Nation.
Excellent. And so real quick, Justine, if you don't mind me asking, when speaking about Lakota Nation, since this is the episode about reconnecting identity, and we'll kind of get into why Indigenous people are a lot of times in that process of reconnecting, would you mind explaining and sharing, if you're comfortable with it, are you a tribal member of the Lakota Nation, or are you just kind of connecting and affiliated with the Lakota Nation?
I am actually enrolled through Rosebud. I actually have my enrollment papers, but I don't have my tribal ID.
That's all right. Excellent. All right. And so, so what you might have noticed there were some terms kind of thrown around: enrollment, tribal ID. So for those that aren't familiar, for Native American peoples, we have had a long history of disassociation, forced relocations, and forced assimilation thrown on our people. That has come at the hands of the United States government, unfortunately. And it a lot of times has been systemic and legal practices, not just the practices of individuals or, quote, bad characters within society. There's a long history of that, starting with the Dawes Act, which was there to kind of change the practice of land belonging to a tribal collective of people, groups, the clans, family members, entering it into individual allotments, which then the United States government used to encourage people to sell their portion of their tribal land so that they could be picked up by the government, whether for public or federal use. That was in the 1800s. And then you had in the late 1800s, around the 1880s, 1860s, all the way through to the 1920s, really, or 1970s, my apologies. You had the Native American boarding schools, which was a institution where Native American children were forcibly removed from their homes, taken to schools, usually run by a church or the federal government, and a lot of times both. And they were kept away from their families, from their culture. They weren't allowed to speak their languages. They had to cut their hair. They had to adopt Christian names, ideologies, and philosophies. These schools were very problematic, ripe with and rampant with abuses, both physical, sexual, and emotional. And a lot of times the people that lived through those experiences, if they ever returned home at all, when they returned home, the traumas impacted them so deeply that they could not connect with their families and their tribes. Along with that, there was also the policy of the Indian Relocation Act, which was done in the 1950s, which was there was a program put in place by the United States government to educate Native American people and to encourage them to move away from their tribal lands and their tribal connections to cities and go to there for trade learning, school, and jobs. The government would say that they would pay these Native American families to move out to these locations, pay for their education, pay for their relocation. But it's been recorded that in up to 70% of cases, they were not given these available funds. And so a lot of times families moved away to cities where they experienced culture shock. They didn't understand the customs. They weren't connected to their communities and often ended up in poverty. Now, like I said, these were all policies of the United States government. And most critics of these things will comment on the fact that this was often done as a precursor to buying up tribal land and to help diminish and remove tribal sovereignty and tribal authority. Now, with that being said, that has forced a lot of people into a kind of state where they're looking to reconnect to their culture and to their heritage. And so that was why I wanted to have Justine join us today to talk about her personal journey and her family's journey in reconnecting to their heritage. So Justine, you're welcome to take it away. Introduce yourself with anything that you might see fit.
Okay, so I read somewhere that was talking about like Indigenous people today. Like many of us have had like a grandfather or grandmother who came from a boarding school, Indian boarding school. And I remember growing up, my dad talking about his mom being in a boarding school and her saying basically what you just said. She wasn't allowed to speak her language. We have a picture of her when she was a little girl, like probably only like 4 or 5 years old, with the little short hair, you know, bangs.
Yeah.
And, that haircut.
Yeah.
But, just like stories that I've heard that if her mom came to bring her like presents for her birthday or any like celebration, they were taken away because it wasn't fair that any of the other kids didn't get something also. So also in the recording, she talks about how she was asked if she felt prepared to live off the reservation from the education she got from the boarding school. And she was like, absolutely not. I didn't receive the same education I would have outside in a regular school. She just talks about how her credits wouldn't transfer. So she's like, these classes I'm taking, they're useless outside. So she wasn't able to, I guess, kind of grow into any opportunities that she would have if she was given a better education.
Yeah, like that's a perfect example of how a lot of times the quote educations that a lot of these young Native children were getting in these schools was like just like basic labor skills, right? How to cook and sew, like those things that, like, although good skills to have, won't provide you necessarily like a career path, right? And so a lot of times, like you said, that they felt, and they very much were, very like unprepared to be able to quote integrate into like the rest of American society, right? And I think that's an excellent thing that you brought up. I think another thing that's really important to talk about is that I think it's real easy for people who aren't from within the Native American and Indigenous community to feel like, well, yeah, all that stuff happened in the past, though. It's long ago. What's that have to do with now? You know? And I think the first thing to understanding is that although what happened long ago in the past, right, we're examples of that wasn't that long ago. For you, it was your grandmother, right? For me, it was my father's of that age. You know, he was born in the 50s. So, you know, he was right in that age group where he was, you know, could have been taken away from his family, his tribal people. You know, my dad's circumstance was a little bit different as he was adopted off of the reservation. But that's just one or two separations, you know, one or two generations of separation from us today, here now. And so that time frame, when you think of it that way, all of a sudden feels a lot shorter and a lot closer to the present. And so it brings up, well, why were these things being allowed to continue for that long? Beyond that, there's also the fact that, like you said, these things were happening to your grandmother, but if you wouldn't mind answering, how has that affected your personal journey in understanding and connecting to your cultural heritage?
My grandmother passed away. I always get confused between lupus and leukemia.
Yeah.
Very similar. So I get, but I know one is actually more more common in Native Americans. So she passed away, I believe, fairly young, in her 30s, let's say. So I actually never met her. Everything I hear is from a recording we had found and stories that have been passed down to me. Yes. So unfortunately, we weren't able to really keep that traditional aspect within our culture, like dancing at the powwows, you know, Lakota. My dad and my aunts and uncles, they got bits and pieces of that as they were growing up, but after she passed away, there really wasn't I guess like
keep that legacy going.
Yeah, to keep it going. So everything I knew was just here and there being told. So the language definitely wasn't passed down. Anything I know is stuff that I research myself.
Mm-hmm.
I say things wrong anyway, but I do try. And then it's basically just you doing everything on your own when you don't have somebody to kind of help you out. And it is hard to find like resources, especially being in California. Like my tribe is in South Dakota.
Yes.
So I think I had mentioned before, it was funny watching Reservation Dogs sing the native girl who came and was kind of joking around like, oh, I'm from Pine Ridge. She's like, my spirit's from Pine Ridge, but I'm from the Bay Area.
Yeah.
And I can definitely relate to that because I'm over here like, my spirit's from Rosebud, but I live in California.
Yeah.
So it's just, it's a bit difficult because outside of your family, and like my family's all separated, so I don't have people I can really go with. Like I've tried to connect with some cousins and be like, oh, you should go to the powwows, we should make our own regalia and start getting into it. And you know, everybody wants to, but they're just busy doing their own thing, and it's hard to get together.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. My apologies.
I'm just saying, it's hard to get everybody together, especially you know, when you're working and everybody lives further apart. And finding people, even people that are native, like, and traditional, that you can kind of learn from, is hard. I don't think I've met many traditional natives in my area. It's pretty common to get the like, oh, I'm native too, you know, and just, oh, cool. But it's sort of just like a, when you claim you're native and you have like no connection at all and you're not trying, but you want to throw it out there in a conversation.
Yeah. At the end, I think that's kind of one of the reasons why I brought up in the beginning is that there's a lot of times, a lot of Indigenous people who are in that stage of reconnecting. And so it might be something where it's like, oh, I might have that connection where I speak regularly with my family, whether they're on the reservation or not. I might have that, you know, kind of audible and vocal connection to my culture, but you're not in a place where you can physically practice those customs with a relative or with a family member to be able to build them into something that is routine and practiced and you know, understood and learned in that way. I think it can be hard for people to understand that separation, but I think a thing that is maybe easy for people that aren't of Indigenous identity to kind of relate to is it's like the same thing for a lot of times when families immigrate into America and their culture is across the ocean in some other country. And so it's harder for them to keep those little threads of connection, whether it be language, food customs, cultural practices, whatever it might be. The same thing is happening for us here as Indigenous peoples, but it's a lot of times it's because of not only the physical distance that we have between us and maybe tribal family members on reservation land if we're in cities or in different states, but it can also too just be that kind of emotional and spiritual gap between somebody who has maybe gone through the traumas of like growing up in the Indian boarding school and then having a grandchild, someone saying, teach me the customs, how do I speak my language? And they might not remember much, or they might feel uncomfortable kind of digging back into that past trauma to bring back customs and culture. And so when you're not, you know, quote, united and surrounded by your tribe, reestablishing those connections is difficult, definitely. So I think that's definitely a very common thing, and you know, something that's really good that you brought up. Continuing in that kind of thread, if you don't mind me asking, at like what age did you kind of take it upon yourself to start really taking an effort to make and establish those kind of connections to try to reconnect to your heritage and your culture? And was that something that you were kind of following in the footsteps of other family members, or were you just kind of prompted to do that on your own?
I think it was actually seeing people around me, like friends getting into their heritage and proud of what, you know, where they came from. And I was like, okay, well, there's a lot of like judgment from, especially when you're growing up, you know, based off of like your culture and, you know, where your family comes from and everything. Like, I mean, it's hard to get into it sometimes because it's intimidating. Like I can recall like talking to a traditional Native person at work, and them being a little bit like judgmental, like, well, do you know what this means? And do you do this? And it's like, oh, okay, like take it back. And it's like, well, how am I supposed to learn?
Yeah.
You're over here like beating me down for not knowing these things.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think it was mostly other people kind of getting into like activism about their own culture, where I was like, I want to do the same thing, you know, like I'm proud of who I am and I want to help any way I can. So probably in about high school, I started doing my own research and kind of thinking like, okay, like what can I get into? What can I help with? So it's more just like educating yourself so you can help educate other people, and then putting yourself in situations and opportunities to do what you can for your people. So I know for like the DAPL, when that came around, there was a fundraiser type thing in downtown Riverside at one of the places I used to go to. So they were doing like donations for you to go in and you listen to some music, and they were collecting blankets, and I like tried to get whoever I could go and you know, just donate, posting informational whatever you can, like petition gatherings. So that was something I really tried to spread awareness about. And like I said, I'm very just trying to educate myself, like any documentary that came up, like we were talking about boarding schools. And I follow a lot of pages, and I believe it's a documentary on Amazon Prime called We Were Children. I watched that and I just cried. So emotional.
And that's a perfect example. Like that can be also too one of the things that can be a little bit of a barrier, I think, for some people in their reconnecting journey. Is that a lot of times, you know, Native American history post European colonization is heavy stuff. You know, there's a lot of traumas involved with that, not just on a personal level, but I think just as a human being, when you have to go after page and page or hour and hour of listening to other humans live through trauma and struggle, it can be tiring. You know, if we're empathetic peoples, you know, that's a lot to take on yourself, you know? And so I think that that can also be one of the barriers where it's, you're like, you're so ready to learn and you want to learn, but then you got to sit through like 3 hours of like just trauma. And you're just, by the time you're done with that, you're like, okay, well now I just need a break.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to take on.
Yeah. You know, so I think there's definitely that hurdle in there as well. Now I know you said so you were kind of like, it was around high school when you started reaching out to that stuff. And I appreciate that you mentioned DAPLO. And for people that aren't familiar with that, that's going to be the Dakota Access Pipeline. That was a issue that a few of the tribes up in the Dakota area were fighting with an oil company as they were trying to put oil lines that crossed across tribal land, across tribal water sources, which is a very common thing that happens, unfortunately, where private sectors, particularly in the oil and the drilling industry, use, whether it's little loopholes in laws or gray areas in laws, or sometimes flat out disrespect and don't adhere to or abide by tribal sovereignty, end up putting their mining or drilling practices or equipment or construction projects right through native land. So, you know, kind of running on that thread, obviously, along with reconnecting, I hear that you're pretty active in, you know, being outspoken and advocating for Native issues. Have you found that that has helped with your reconnecting process as you kind of start to reach out and engage with other Indigenous people? Or would you say that that's kind of like a separate thing where it's just something that you're also working on while reconnecting?
I feel it is connected, but just not as much in the like traditional sense. It's more like educational and I guess like more current issues that you're kind of, you want to educate yourself and spread awareness, educate other people. And like in that process though, it sort of gets you looking back at everything from before you knew. Like my mom, she really pushed Pocahontas on me when I was little. It's like I had Pocahontas like dolls and a bed sheet and everything, and she would call me like her little Pocahontas. And then now I'm like, I don't know about that. You think about it, and it's like once you kind of learn your history, it's like that probably wasn't a good idea to make it a kids movie. Like that's very whole different story. So I feel like it did kind of motivate me though to add it into my like actual school education further on. So going into college, I would write, papers, and I would always try to find some way to relate my culture into whatever paper I was writing, whether it was just like, I believe in communications, I did a presentation about Columbus Day. And I was like, obviously we shouldn't be having that. Like we know our history now. So that's something that we need to take care of, replace, get rid of, change completely.
Definitely.
So I was, I guess, trying to add everything, and like I said, spread awareness through my classes.
Yeah. So it sounds like to me, like you said, they're kind of like separate in a sense, but they also kind of like reaffirm both processes, so to speak. While you're learning about your history, it kind of, I think, encourages a lot of people to engage in current activism over current issues that we're facing as Indigenous people, and then vice versa, as you're kind of on the front lines or doing stuff, whether it's through social media or, like you said, writing papers, helping to build awareness. You start to get those little moments where you see the connection between this historic policy that happened back in 1950 connecting right through to this issue that we're fighting on today over land usage rights and stuff like that, or water usage rights. I think it's really easy to kind of make those connections, those through lines into the past, affecting our contemporary lives. Now, talking about school, because I want to kind of jump on the issue a little bit, because you reminded me of a couple of stories myself. I don't know if you ever had this experience, but I know for myself, that as I was younger, I didn't really start reconnecting to my heritage until I was in like about my high school years as well. I remember though being in like elementary school and like even like middle school, when stuff about Native American culture would pop up, there would be such this turmoil, this little mix of emotions of feeling like everybody's going to expect me to have the answers on everything, but I don't feel confident in like knowing all the answers,
Exactly.
And just that kind of like tug of war, internally of being like, well, I feel like I definitely know some things, right? Because you hear some of the stories, whatever little bits you have learned, whether it's because you've researched it yourself or you've learned from family. But then feeling like you maybe are still kind of missing big holes and big chunks, and that kind of fear of like, oh, but if somebody questions you, I'm like, oh, well, you're not really Native enough because of this, that, or whatever reason. Like, how do you confront that hurdle?
Exactly. Yeah.
I remember that because it was just one of those things. Like at that point, I didn't know what tribes I came from. So it was just because of the differences in tribes. It's like, oh, like maybe we're learning about, like, say, for example, Pocahontas, right? Some of the Powhatan, the Eastern tribes there, and I'm going like, they're like, oh, well, is this true? And everybody's kind of looking at you like, well, what do you say, Native American person in class? And you're just kind of like, well, I don't know. And they're like, well, why don't you know? It's like, well, it's not my tribe. I'm like, well, what tribe's yours?
Yeah.
And that can be really kind of, that can be a struggle. That can be a struggle to kind of overcome those feelings of insecurities and everything like that. So I know that's something I experienced. Did you ever experience anything like that growing up?
Definitely, especially in high school. And I feel like it's it sucks. I mean, obviously you don't want I guess people pointing out, like you said, like, oh, you're not Native enough because you don't know this. And really it's not at our own fault, it's it's not like we intentionally like avoid our culture or anything. I had a story in my head. Hold on.
Always.
Oh, okay. So my school, actually in high school, they did a Cowboys and Indians Day.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, is this happening? Like, is this really, like, people are going to dress up? And I felt so like, dang, they're allowing this, and there's not enough natives at school to be like, hey, this isn't okay. We don't want random people dressing up, as cowboys and playing around. So I think I actually wore a powwow shirt that day that said like, is the old one, our heroes, your enemies. And it had and everybody on it. So, and in the back, it had the reverse with, more of the Catholic priests and everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just remember thinking like, sometimes I think back and I'm like, I should have protested. I should have, brought something up, like, because now I believe, hopefully most schools would be smart enough not to do that. I know the mascot issue is still, one that we're fighting for across the country. So that's just something I kind of keep in mind, like, well, one step at a time.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I remember, and man, I was in elementary school and I couldn't say specifically what grade because I'm old and so that's long ago. But I remember where for an assignment, the teacher was kind of using the like cowboys and Indians analogy, like, oh, well, some of you will be cowboys, some of you are going to be Indians. And I remember because there was a kid, he shot his hand up immediately. He's like, teacher, Mrs. So-and-so, like, oh, Dakota can't be a cowboy. And it was like, okay, thanks for like putting me on the spot, bro. Like,
Yeah.
And it was just one of those things where we're just like, at the time, I felt so like embarrassed about that. Man, yeah, I can't be a cowboy. I felt so isolated and excluded. Whereas like nowadays, I'm like, oh yeah, I wouldn't want to be a cowboy. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I had another situation where I was at a school that I believe were like the Indians, Indian mascot or something. And I played basketball. And I was shooting free throws and everybody in the crowd was like doing war cries at me.
Yeah, like war whooping.
Yeah, and I was just like, okay. And like, I know they were doing it more for like their school rather than like, hey, she's Native or anything like that. But I made my free throws though, so it didn't faze me.
That's all it matters.
But yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, just being called out like that, sort of, and then how you were saying, like when people ask you questions, I feel like that was also a way of, for me, like I felt kind of ashamed for not knowing, but that also motivated me to learn more. That's why I do, like, if there's a documentary out or like a paper I could read, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna learn this because I want to know next time somebody talks about it. But yeah, I do feel like it's something that I kind of am like challenged for, and I do like to challenge myself, so it keeps me curious.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that's a great thing to do. And it's a great kind of attitude and mentality to kind of approach it with, where it's like, just because it's a moment where you as an individual felt insecure or maybe embarrassed, or like you said, ashamed about whether it's your lack of knowledge, or maybe even the fact of like having a little bit of a knowledge on something, but not feeling like you can like articulate or express it well enough to be able to channel that into a drive to go learn more, I think is a really good thing. And hopefully it's something that people can kind of adopt if they're in that kind of phase of life, because like I said, reconnecting is a ongoing thing. And so you can be in that stage, well in adulthood, not just as a child. So with that, though, we will take a short little break. And when we come back, I'm going to talk to Justine. I want to ask her a question about terminology and identity. With that, we will take a quick break. All right, so yeah, actually, we're not going to take a break right here, obviously. This is if you want to get up and use the restroom or anything, of course, feel free to do so. Obviously, this little part will be edited out and cut out. But yeah, so I did want to talk to you real quick about, like I said, terminology and identity. So obviously we'll touch on the one about like the different terminologies that have existed throughout the decades and years. Everybody has their own preference. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Like for myself, I know I really prefer the term indigenous.
Yeah.
It disassociates our culture with American society and thus colonial, uh, colonization, colonial practices of genocide and intimidation and relocation. It removes us from being a quote minority community and reconnects us, in my opinion, to our greater history that exists outside of Europeans showing up on our shores. You know what I mean? I also like it's kind of more inclusive of all of our cultures across the Americas. You talk about people, indigenous people in the Arctic, Canadian First People, indigenous people here in the States, Central America, Mexico, South America, all that. So, but obviously not everybody has to agree to those terms, and that doesn't have to affect our validity and our experience as a Native person,
I know it's funny because like I usually never really say like Indian, like
Yeah.
my boyfriend knows like when people say Indian, I'm kind of like,
Yeah.
but I was like, it's one of those things where like we could say it, but you guys shouldn't say it because it's like you're gonna get a look from me.
Yeah.
But yeah, I prefer like First Nations, Indigenous,
Mhm.
or like honestly, I do usually will like if I mention like being Indigenous at all, I will be like I'm Lakota. So I let people know directly, if that's how you want to refer, you can refer to me as that. Like there's, a whole bunch of different ways to say it. But if you want to just say Lakota when you're referring to me, that's fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, that's actually probably right what we'll kind of touch on. Because actually that is something too that like I would love it if we could be to a point in our society as a whole. And when I say our society, I don't mean just like as indigenous people, but like American society overall. If we could get to that point where there's the respect and recognition of the tribes themselves, and I think personally, that's part of tribal sovereignty. As we kind of fight to get better autonomy for self-governance, but also representation in broader American Congress, society, policymaking. When we're at a point where the average quote American citizen or white person can sit there and identify and differentiate tribes easily, then we'll probably also be at the same time in a place where a lot of the kind of negative parts of being a minority aren't impacting the culture so much, So I'm hoping for better futures, but we'll see where it heads. Welcome back from the break, everyone. In case you're just joining us, I'm with my guest, Justine Wills, member of the Dakota Nation. And right before the break, I had asked you a question, Justine. I had asked you about your thoughts on terminology and identity, especially within the Indigenous community. So if you might notice there, I used a different term, Indigenous, not Native. Now, just for quick reference, Indigenous refers to any people that are native to a place or to an origin. Whereas obviously the term Native American refers specifically to the indigenous people, usually it's to the United States, not always necessary to like Canada or Mexico. So with that kind of very brief and simplistic breakdown of the terms, I'm curious, for you as an individual, do you have a preference of terminology used? And do you yourself feel like there is an importance to either a kind of coalition of terminology or like a separation of terminology?
I do think indigenous is probably the best way to refer to our people. I mean, I prefer indigenous, First Nations, or if you're referring to a specific tribe, I feel like that's really respectful, you know, like
Yeah.
to identify them. But it's also something to think about for, like you were saying, terms, mixed blood, full blood, all that. Like for me, I'm mixed, so indigenous would cover that, you know, more Mexican, Aztec aspect of being indigenous also.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And I think there's, that's a really, really great valid point to bring up because, prior to European colonizers showing up in the Americas, there weren't borders. There wasn't people from, none of the tribes, none of the peoples from the northern Canada area were like going and pointing at people from down in what we call now Mexico, being like, oh, well, you're not indigenous, you don't belong here, right? Sure, tribes and cultures, they had their homelands, their ancestral lands, their hunting lands, right? There were, quote, areas that we even fought and conflicted over. But there was I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say it's like we're all one people.
Yeah.
That just spread out.
Yeah, we didn't exclude others from like, oh, you can't be in this area because this is our land and you can't cross it because you belong to that land or whatever. There was a understanding that I think kind of is a basis for most Native American cultures, that all life is sacred, that all beings belong to the earth, that nobody has kind of superiority over any part of the earth because none of us live longer than it. We all die in it,
Everything's connected.
Exactly.
That's one of the, I believe, Lakota sayings also. I don't know if I pronounce it right, but Mitakuye Oyasin, of all my relations.
Yes. Yeah, I want to say it sounded right from the other Lakota people I've known from. So good job on that one. Yeah, I think within that too, there's also the comments on how a lot of times terminology has been used to divide us as a people, like you were talking about earlier with blood quantum. For people that aren't familiar with that, and I believe it was actually during the Dawes Act where it brought up blood quantum as a way to, quote, identify Indianness, as the term was used back then. Back then, Native American didn't exist as a terminology. It was Indian or American Indian, if you were, quote, like being respectful. And so to decide who was worthy of occupying and owning tribal lands, the federal government brought up this system of blood quantum, even though there wasn't really any kind of scientific methods for testing blood quantum, right? Because if anyone who has studied their DNA and their genetics know, there's nothing in our blood as humans that says like, oh, this person is African, this person is Chinese, this person is Native American. It's you have traits that provide certain features and are common among other specific cultural groups and ethnic groups, but our blood's all the same. At the end of the day, as the old saying goes, we all bleed the same color blood. But the federal government made it a point to decide that you had blood quantum, so full blood people and mixed blood people. And what might surprise some people that aren't familiar with it is that a lot of times full blood people didn't mean that you were worthy of owning Native American land allotments. A lot of times when the federal government was stepping in, they were prioritized giving land rights to mixed blood tribal members, because as the laws were written, full-blood tribal members were savages, they were uncivilized, they were uneducated, right, to European customs. And so a lot of times they gave preference and privilege to people that were of mixed blood to get these plots of land, to get usage rights, at least in a legal sense, as recognized by the federal government. And so that has, in some cases, historically, and sometimes even carries over contemporarily, caused a lot of division in some tribes and even in some clans and families. So I know that can be a very traumatic thing. So I won't ask you to kind of comment on that from your own personal experience. If you want to share anything, of course, you're welcome to that. But to kind of sidestep that narrative of that kind of the impact of and the damage that was done because of laws such as that. Just going back to, like I said, speaking about terminology, when you have stuff like that, where even within your own people, your own cultural group, your own quote race, when you're being separated and categorized, it can be a very anxiety-inducing thing for a person, especially when you are reconnected. Like I talked about, sharing stories about feeling not quite validated or authentic in your own native and indigenous identity. For yourself, just speaking for yourself, do you think that those are things that we as a people, as quote native people, should we be fighting and advocating for policy changes to kind of remove those things from tribal language and enrollment altogether?
That's a tough one, because I know there's a lot of like politics involved in it.
Yes.
And to like redo the whole system, you'd have to get like everybody on board. You're going to make a lot of people unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
And it also kind of comes down to, I know there's like issues about like who's more native. And that's basically what people are talking about right now. Because at what point are you not as native? Like at what point do you not get land, For me, that's like one of the first things people say if you say you're native, like, oh, you get money. And it's so stressful to hear, because I'm like, where is this? Like, show me, please. Tell me where the money is. Or like, you go to school for free and all this stuff. And I'm like, and that might be, true for some people. And, like I said, different tribes and everything, and the amount of money when it comes to casinos or your blood amount and everything like that. There's also, you were saying mixed blood, full blood, pure blood. So, because you could be full blood without being pure blood. So that's just something I feel some people are very proud of. Which is totally great. And, but it also leaves the mixed natives like, okay, at what point am I too mixed where I don't get any benefits, or I shouldn't even try to reconnect, if I'm barely there, it goes too far back. So, I feel like that would be a tough subject to kind of get everybody on the same page, because there's so many different beliefs.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think, and I mean, my apologies, it was intentionally a very tough question, because I wanted that to be a perfect example, and you did an excellent job with that. I think you were very, very articulate in your response to that, and very considerate of the fact that there are a lot of viewpoints, and a lot of different opinions and kind of stakes involved in those terminologies, and it affects how we as Native people, whether we're reconnecting, whether we're fully connected to tribes, it can affect our own personal views of ourselves. It can affect our views of each other, our relatives, and our relations. I know that for myself, I understand that, like, from a policy standpoint and from kind of like the point of like a legal issue, completely getting rid of those terminologies would be very, very difficult, and maybe cause more harm in the short term than it would make up for in the long run. But I wonder if there's maybe not a value or a credit to if we as, quote, as kind of like a pan-Indian cultural collective, if removing those kind of terminologies from our personal engagements, like when we're engaging and speaking with each other, whether it's across tribes, whether it's, on social media, whether it's even just within family, not defining our identities on these colonial notions and institutions of indigeneity, of nativeness. I think there's something to be said about the fact that could maybe heal some of those kind of barriers and hurts that have been in place by reaching out and saying, like, yeah, you're mixed, but you're my relative. We belong to the same tribe, we belong to the same people, and we are, descendants of the same struggle. Like you said, I'm sure that there are some people who are very, very proud of their pure blood, right? Or their full blood status. And I don't want to take that away from people.
Yeah.
But, as a fellow Indigenous person who is reconnecting and who is mixed ethnically, I think that it goes a long way in helping us to, as a whole, reconnect and heal from the kind of historic traumas that have been placed upon us. Now to kind of sidestep kind of the more, broader philosophical aspect of that, for yourself personally, did you notice, like, as you were growing and as you were kind of re-engaging and reconnecting, did your opinions about the terminology that you used, either for yourself or to refer to other Native and Indigenous peoples, did that change as you were going through that process of reconnection?
I don't think I ever really referred to myself as Indian.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I always felt like it was weird, and I knew it wasn't really correct.
Yeah.
So I don't think that, like, strangely, like, I feel okay when I'm talking to another Indigenous person to say Indian. I think I told you before, like, we can say it, but when somebody else says it, it's like, you gotta watch what you're saying. It kind of comes out disrespectful, or I don't know, like a certain tone or connection with it sometimes when somebody's saying it. It's like, you can say Indigenous or First Nation or somebody, their tribe or something specific like that. But yeah, I think mostly I've always said Native, even Native American. Sometimes I've kind of had an issue with. I'm like, well, it wasn't America. So I was just native to this land, So just that connection with, like, America, like, when did it become America?
I think that's especially prominent too for us Native and Indigenous peoples from the United States, because a lot of times in broader American culture, right? And then right there, I'm in my own answer using an example of that. A lot of times as members of the United States, we refer to ourselves as America. And in reality, Mexico is America, Canada is America, and then there's also Central America and South America. And so, these are continents, not countries. That terminology in of itself is kind of incorrect in that regard, in that a Native American person could be somebody from the Arctic Circle in Alaska, or somebody an Indigenous person down in, like, Chile. So, that in of itself kind of causes problems. And so that's why I agree with you in the sense that a lot of times I won't use the term Native American, just shorten it into Native. Right? Because you get into that kind of tricky terminology of, the United States is America, when, why does that exclude Canada and Mexico? But forgive me, I kind of lost my own train of thought there for a second. So in regard to that, do you think, and I guess this is kind of a weird ask, but do you think that it's harder for non-Indigenous people, non-Native people, to understand and respect our fight for terminology and changes in that? And, like, for example, like with mascots and stuff like that, do you think it's harder for them to understand that when we as a people, there's not just one group. Native American doesn't just encompass one culture, one language, one religious practice, right? Like you said, there's multiple tribes, there's multiple nations, there's multiple peoples all across the Americas. Do you think that does our kind of lack of unity, so to speak, hamper our fight for causes such as changing names, identities, and terminologies, stuff like that?
I feel like it would be hard in general for basically anybody outside the culture unless they've really experienced it themselves. I believe like when I was studying, I was reading about different genocides, and that everybody assumes like, oh, the Holocaust, like right away.
Yeah.
But you're like, that's the only one you learn about.
Yeah.
In school. America was a Holocaust.
Yeah.
Armenian Holocaust, you don't learn about those.
Yeah.
So that's just something that kind of puts into perspective, like, okay, this is what you know, but this is what you don't know. And this is also similar to what you've been learning, but what has been kept from you. Yeah, I do believe that it's harder for people to kind of understand and see just perspective. I believe my grandma was saying in one of her previous recordings that she had experienced racism off the reservation, and she was like blown away that like, I've been so nice to my neighbor, like why don't they like me? And so she had went up to them and was like, did I do something? Like, why are you being so rude to me? And he was like, I don't like Mexicans. And she was like, well, I'm not Mexican.
Yeah.
So, I'm actually I'm Native, and he was like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, I didn't know, and then he started being nice. He's like, I actually love Natives. And she was like, but why would you be mean to me if I was Mexican? Like,
yeah.
She didn't understand that,
Yeah.
So it's just like kind of an interesting perspective for you don't know what other people think, and how they're going to react to you and to different situations and people.
Yeah.
I do feel like it's hard for people to kind of get a grasp on just culture.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously, I think a lot of that is obviously having access to the actual history and to the proper information, because so much of our history as Native and as Indigenous peoples has been kind of whitewashed and removed or just kind of completely ignored from a lot of history texts and a lot of school curriculums. A lot of times for both Native and non-Native people, learning about those things comes usually in higher education, when you're in college, university, and stuff like that. Whether it's because those are part of the curriculum or it's just because it's something where you start learning about those things when you're going through social or ethnic studies. To kind of jump back a bit, though, in speaking to the issue of your grandmother, her dealing with that racism, misidentification, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure you've experienced it, but if you wouldn't mind kind of sharing if you have any kind of similar stories from your own personal life. And did you ever find a state where you say maybe we're just like really adamant of like, oh no, I'm not this group, I'm this group. And then has that kind of attitude changed? Because I know I can speak for myself. When I was younger, if anyone ever thought that I was like Samoan or Filipino, like I really took offense to it. Like, no, I'm Native American and I'm mixed, but like, and then as I got older, I kind of started recognizing like a lot of the times those misidentifications, they're not, although racism itself is bad, right? Like I'm not taking offense to the fact that you think I'm a different culture. I'm taking offense to the fact that you are hating or mistreating or judging me based on the fact that you think I'm a different culture than yours. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I definitely have experienced a lot of like racism. And it's crazy too, because I guess in high school, especially when you're dealing with younger people, you know, kids are kids.
Blunt.
So it came kind of more masked or covered as, oh, it's a joke. It's a joke, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
Yeah.
So just like little things, like being called Pocahontas, Tiger Lily. Recently, actually, too, with adults, like you'd be surprised with how many people think it's okay to throw a little
Yeah.
humor into their racism. So I was working somewhere and I had let the person I was working under know, like, oh, I'm Native. And my friend had taken me axe throwing. And it was my first time, you know, and I recorded a few times because I was like, oh my gosh, I'm good at this. Like I'm getting the
Nice.
bullseye every time. And I had came and I was like, oh my gosh, it was so much fun, you know, like showing people at work. And he was like, well, you would be good at throwing that, right? And I was just like, kind of quiet. I didn't really say anything.
Yeah.
I don't like to give reactions when people do that because I just like to kind of watch them explain themselves, you know, like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
like that funny. And then they're like, because it's racist. That's why it's funny, you know? So stuff like that. And then I have actually been like, I guess, misidentified. It's usually people telling me I have small eyes.
Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah, so that's something that's pretty common.
Mm-hmm.
But one person was like, oh, you have high cheekbones. That's why your eyes look small. And I'm like, okay, thank you, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's something I really don't know how to react to.
Yeah.
I feel like they intend it to be a compliment.
Yeah.
But it's just something that I'm kind of like, oh, that's an interesting observation, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And I have been told that I have a white voice. So that's something that I'm actually pretty self-conscious about. So
Yeah.
I don't know if it's I always just thought like I'm speaking proper grammar, you know? I don't really use any terms,
Like slang terminology.
like that's what I'm thinking of. Or if I do, maybe it sounds like too much from California, so
Yeah.
automatically is like white sounding.
Yeah.
I don't think I like overdo it. Like I don't think I say like, I don't know what's typical California slang. I don't even know. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't like naturally throw that out in a
Yeah.
conversation. Maybe dude or rad, tubular. Any of
Bros were common.
yeah, okay, stuff like
Hello, if we were from the Bay Area.
that. But yeah, I don't really intentionally try to make myself one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of just other people's response to how I look, how I talk.
Yeah.
And again, that just might be more of an environmental situation, you know, kind of what I'm surrounded by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of, dialect, a lot of how you sound, the accents you carry as a person, a lot of that comes from your surroundings anyway, you know? But I think I'm glad that you was sharing this because I think it touches on a thing about identity when we're talking about, particularly, I think a lot of cultures can relate to this, but for Native American people, the idea that we have to sound a certain way, especially from like broader, American society or white society, to kind of be blunt about it. There's this idea that we have to sound like how we sound in movies and in TV. And it was funny because I actually bumped into a scenario kind of recently where I had at my day job, my regular job, I had a customer that was coming in. And so I don't remember exactly how through the course of conversation, I think they probably had mentioned that they were watching Res Dogs. And it was probably something where they were like, oh, well, I'm going to mention this because I think he might be Native American, but I don't know. And so, we were talking about that. And so then they were talking about because the Res Dogs, the show, they say like Skoden and Studis so much. And, the guest was asking, and they're like, oh, so like, do all like natives say that? Like, is that common? Is that like a traditional word? And I was like, it's let's go then smoke together. Like, like it was one of those things where it was, you know, obviously they're not trying to be intentionally like disrespectful, right? Or belittling of our culture, but it's something where it's like they didn't have any other reference for it.
Yeah.
And the thing that they learned about Native American people, and hopefully they took more away from the show than just that. But one of the things that they latched on was like, oh, that cool terminology that the natives are using,
Yeah.
you know? And so there's kind of one of those scenarios where it's like, yeah, it's kind of funny and like, yeah, you can chuckle about it, but it's an example of kind of a bigger, broader issue of that for a lot of people in American society, their ideas and the opinions that they formulate about Native and Indigenous identity is strictly from TV shows, movies, books, which we know a lot of times are very inaccurate, you know? And so it's interesting because that's a scenario where it's like, even in what I feel like is a positive example of Native peoples and Native American culture, I think the show does a good thing of showing us in a more contemporary light, as opposed to that kind of historic, like, oh, the old noble savage person, you know, like, or whatever, the kind of characters that people develop. It still kind of carries in a little bit just because of lack of exposure a lot of times. Where this person,
but that's kind of a give and take thing with just getting more exposure at all, you know, because it's kind of like just when I was growing up, like obviously there was only Pocahontas. Like what else do I have to look at?
Pocahontas, Dances with Wolves, Thunderheart. You got 3.
Well, actually, I actually remember watching something. My dad was watching TV, and it was like a Native show. And I just remembered like one part of it, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever, and I wanted to watch it, but it was like back in the day where like you change the channel and you lose it forever, you know?
Yeah.
And I was young and I didn't even know how to like work the TV. So it took me like forever. Like I'm saying, I was probably like under 10 years old watching it. And one of my Indigenous friends, I was like, okay, have you ever seen this show? And I was explaining the scene, and he was like, oh, you're talking about Dreamkeeper. And I was like, what's that? Is that what it's called? And he's like, yeah, that's what you were watching. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I was so excited. And I went home and I looked it up and I watched it. And I was like, this is it. I found it. Like I was so excited. And it's just something that I remember watching when I was little that, you know, I connected with. I really thought was interesting. And I couldn't find it because I have nobody around me, you know, to show me like that I would talk to that would know what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's great though that you did end up finding it eventually. And it wasn't something where like looking back on it, you watch it again, you're like, oh.
No, actually, I love it still. Like I watch it all the time. And it's interesting because I feel like it was maybe like a little thing where I was like, well, I'm Native and this is Native. So, you know, that's just what I had. And for my daughter growing up, she liked watching Miraculous, I think. It's like a ladybug superhero show. And I remember watching an episode of that, and they have like a little Indigenous superhero, and she had a Lakota flag shirt on.
Oh, that's great.
Oh my gosh. And I saw it and I recognized it right away. And I was so like impressed because I was like, I've never seen that, you know, like I didn't have that growing up. So I just thought it was really cool.
Oh yeah, no, that's great.
I knew what it was, but I was really excited to watch it.
But she'll see that excitement, and then, you know, she'll learn later on as well too. Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think it's great that, you know, like I said, we are having better representation as Indigenous people, as Native people nowadays than at any other point in you know, our history and in American history. That's part of the reason why I wanted to do these recordings, you know, working with this podcast, being a part of it. And it made it easy to just kind of do it right now because it's Native American Heritage Month, you know. But that was also too why I wanted to bring you in, because I wanted to show an example of the many different identities and experiences and perspectives that we have as Indigenous people, about that we can be in different aspects of reconnecting, whether we've grown up on res or not, that we can have different aspects of cultural history, right? Our kind of broader cultural history. I, have some people I know of that have grown up on the reservation their whole lives. And although they speak their language and they understand their traditional customs fairly well, they might not necessarily know the history of all the stuff that have been done to us as Indigenous peoples very, very well, just because, a lot of times, like I said, that can be kind of hard to bring back up. And so they're growing up, sure, in their language and in their custom, but they're not really learning the history of what we've gone through as a quote, a people. And, like you said, representation matters, identity matters. And those are things that the more we give a microphone and a lens to people to share their stories, to create their voices and share their voices, the better opportunities people have to learn, to reconnect, to engage with each other over shared and similar experiences. And I think it's overall, a step in us overcoming and rebuilding ourselves, and having a better stake in our own, identities, so to speak, and our own destinies as not only individuals, but as clans, as tribes, as a, quote, cultural group. So I do want to very much thank you for your time, Justine. I don't want to keep you all night, as we all have our own lives to live. So I would like to invite you in to maybe, again, some of our other recordings where we're going to be speaking with other people. So I'd love to have you along for that if you're available.
Of course.
But otherwise, I want to say thank you very much for your time tonight. Thank you for sharing your story and your wisdom and your voice. And have a good night.